dweller of the dark. We are a channel honoring the yellow and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. Comment below if you like. If you have authors that you'd like to see recognized, list them in the comments or contact our author page. Authors, always looking for fresh blood. Subscribe and contact us for more information. Subscribe for more tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten. We'll have quite a collection, climbing out of the tombs. If you like any of our tales, crush or cut the like button below. Check out our other stories on YouTube and our websites. YouTube, Dweller of the Dark. Official website, dwellerofthedark.com. You can find us on Facebook at Jeffrey LeBlanc, horror writer. Find our books on Amazon. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon, and Bandcamp. Dweller of the Dark. An aged cloak turns a man into a vampire. A hotel clerk has trouble controlling his murderous mother. And a lunar flower causes people to howl at the moon as werewolves. As we cut across the block to another ripping yarn from Robert Bloch. His latest tale may get him hunted by Jack the Ripper. Our From the Grave mentor, Robert Bloch, was a fiction writer with a diverse array of stories in crime, horror, fantasy, and science fiction. He is best known as the writer of Psycho that led to Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece. Many great tales on Rod Serling's Night Gallery, Weird Tales, Strange Stories, and others. Our personal favorite is Bloch's script for the Hammer horror film classic, The House That Dripped Blood. Horror and comedy were his trademark. Robert Bloch's fondness for humor in horror was evident in puns that can be seen in titles such as Tales in a Jugular Vein, Such Stuff as Screams Are Made Of, and Out of the Mouth of Graves. And of course, as the classic Bloch favorite line that tickles our funny bone, I have the heart of a child. I keep it in a jar on my shelf. A protege to H.P. Lovecraft, Robert Bloch was in a select group known as the Lovecraft Circle, with such greats as Frank Belknap Long, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, and many more. Learning with these masters, Bloch created hundreds of short stories and over 30 novels. Robert Bloch won numerous awards in writing. He won the Hugo Award for That Hellbound Train, the Bram Stoker Award, and the World Fantasy Award. Bloch served a term as president of the Mystery Writers of America in 1970. He was a member of the Mystery Writers of America, Science Fiction Writers of America, Writers Guild of America, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Most notably, as one society he probably still is an undead member of, the Count Dracula Society. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper, is a short story written by Robert Bloch and published for Weird Tales in July 1943. This ghastly horror mystery, no doubt, influenced time after time. A 1979 science fiction horror movie starring legendary actors Malcolm McDowell and David Warner. Bloch's version, though, brings pulse-pounding dread and a twisting staircase of terror. This lurid tale centers on Sir Guy Hollis and psychiatrist John Carmody's investigation of a serial killer in present-day Chicago. Sir Guy Hollis believes the murderer to be the legendary Jack the Ripper. Can Sir Guy and John Carmody find this maniac to stop the murders? Or will they both fall prey to the blade of Jack the Ripper? Yours truly, Jack the Ripper, by Robert Bloch. I looked at the stage Englishman. He looked at me. Sir Guy Hollis? I asked. Indeed. Have I the pleasure of addressing John Carmody, the psychiatrist? I nodded. My eyes swept over the figure of my distinguished visitor. Tall, lean, sandy-haired, with a traditional tufted mustache. and the tweeds. I suspected a monocle concealed in a vest pocket and wondered if he'd left his umbrella in the outer office. But more than that, I wondered what the devil had impelled Sir Guy Hollis of the British Embassy to seek out a total stranger here in Chicago. Sir Guy didn't help matters any as he sat down. He cleared his throat, glanced around nervously, tapped his pipe against the side of the desk. Then he opened his mouth. "Mr. Carmody," he said, "have you ever heard of Jack the Ripper?" "The murderer?" I asked. "Exactly. The greatest monster of them all. Worse than Spring-Heeled Jack or Crippen. Jack the Ripper. Red Jack." "I've heard of him," I said. "Do you know his history?" "Listen, Sir Guy," I muttered. "I don't think we'll get any place swapping old wives' tales about famous crimes of history." Another bullseye. He took a deep breath. "This is no old wives' tale. It's a matter of life or death." He was so wrapped up in his obsession, he even talked that way. Well, I was willing to listen. We psychiatrists get paid for listening. "Go ahead," I told him. "Let's have the story." Sir Guy lit a cigarette and began to talk. "London, 1888, he began. Late summer and early fall. That was the time. Out of nowhere came the shadowy figure of Jack the Ripper, a stalking shadow with a knife, prowling through London's East End, haunting the squalid dives of Whitechapel, Spitalfields. Where he came from, no one knew. But he brought death in a knife. 6 times that knife descended to slash the throats and bodies of London's women, drabs and alley sluts. August 7 was the date of the first butchery. They found her body lying there with 39 stab wounds, a ghastly murder. On August 31st, another victim. The press became interested. The slum inhabitants were more deeply interested still. Who was this unknown killer who prowled in their midst and struck at will in the deserted alleyways of Night Town? And what was more important, when would he strike again? September 8th was the date. Scotland Yard assigned special deputies. Rumors ran rampant. The atrocious nature of the slayings was the subject for shock and speculation. The killer used a knife expertly. He cut throats and removed certain portions of the bodies after death. He chose victims and settings with a fiendish deliberation. No one saw him or heard him. The watchmen, making their gray rounds in the dawn, would stumble across the hacked and hard thing that was the Ripper's handiwork. Who was he? What was he? A mad surgeon? A butcher? An insane scientist? A pathological degenerate escaped from an asylum? A deranged nobleman? A member of the London police? Then, the poem appeared in the newspaper. The anonymous poem, designed to put a stop to speculations, but which only aroused public interest to a further frenzy. A mocking little stanza. I'm not a butcher, I'm not a yid, nor yet a foreign skipper, but I'm your own true loving friend, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. And on September 30th, 2 more throats were slashed open. I interrupted Sir Guy for a moment. "Very interesting," I commented. I'm afraid a faint hint of sarcasm crept into my voice. He winced, but didn't falter in his narrative. There was silence. Then, in London for a time, silence and a nameless fear. When would Red Jack strike again? They waited through October. Every figment of fog concealed his phantom presence, concealed it well, for nothing was learned of the Ripper's identity or his purpose. The drabs of London shivered in the raw wind of early November. Shivered and were thankful for the coming of each morning's sun. November 9th, they found her in her room. She lay there very quietly, limbs neatly arranged, and beside her, with equal neatness, were laid her head and heart. The Ripper had outdone himself in execution. Then panic, but needless panic. For though press, police, and populace alike awaited in sick dread, Jack the Ripper did not strike again. Months passed. A year. The immediate interest died, but not the memory. They said Jack had skipped to America, that he had committed suicide. They said, and they wrote. They've written ever since. Theories, hypotheses, arguments, treatises. But to this day, no one knows who Jack the Ripper was, or why he killed, or why he stopped killing. The guy was silent. Obviously, he expected some comment from me. You tell the story well, I remarked, though with a slight emotional bias. I've got all the documents, said Sir Guy Hollis. I've made a collection of existing data and studied it. I stood up. Well, I yawned in mock fatigue. I've enjoyed your little bedtime story a great deal, Sir Guy. It was kind of you to abandon your duties at the British Embassy to drop in on a poor psychiatrist and regale him with your anecdotes. Goading him always did the trick. I suppose you want to know why I'm interested, he snapped. Yes, that's exactly what I'd like to know. Why are you interested? Because, said Sir Guy Hollis, I'm on the trail of Jack the Ripper now. I think he's here, in Chicago. I sat down again. This time, I did the blinking act. Say that again? I stuttered. Jack the Ripper is alive in Chicago, and I'm out to find him. Wait a minute, I said. Wait a minute. He wasn't smiling. It wasn't a joke. See here, I said. What was the date of these murders? August to November, 1888. 1888? But if Jack the Ripper was an able-bodied man in 1888, he'd surely be dead today. Why, look, man, if he were merely born in that year, he'd be 57 years old today. Would he? Smiled Sir Guy Hollis. Or should I say, would she? Because Jack the Ripper may have been a woman, or any number of things. Sir Guy, I said, you came to the right person when you looked me up. You definitely need the services of a psychiatrist. Perhaps. Tell me, Mr. Carmody, do you think I'm crazy? I looked at him and shrugged, but I had to give him a truthful answer. Frankly, no. Then, you might listen to the reasons I believe Jack the Ripper is alive today. I might. I've studied these cases for 30 years, been over the actual ground, talked to officials, talked to friends and acquaintances of the poor drabs who were killed, visited with men and women in the neighborhood, collected an entire library of material touching on Jack the Ripper, studied all the wild theories or crazy notions. I learned a little, not much, but a little. I won't bore you with my conclusions, but there was another branch of inquiry that yielded more fruitful return. I have studied unsolved crimes, murders. I could show you clippings from the papers of half the world's great cities: San Francisco, Shanghai, Calcutta, Omsk, Paris, Berlin, Pretoria, Cairo, Milan, Adelaide. The trail is there, the pattern. Unsolved crimes, slashed throats of women, with the peculiar disfigurations and removals. Yes, I followed a trail of blood from New York westward across the continent, then to the Pacific, from there to Africa. During the World War of 1914-18, it was Europe. After that, South America. And since 1930, the United States again. 87 such murders. And to their trained criminologists, all bear the stigma of the Ripper's handiwork. Recently, there were the so-called Cleveland torso slayings. Remember? A shocking series. And finally, 2 recent deaths in Chicago within the past 6 months. One out on South Dearborn, the other somewhere up on Halsted. Same type of crime, same technique. I tell you, there are unmistakable indications in all these affairs. Indications of the work of Jack the Ripper. I smiled. Very tight theory, I said. I'm not questioning your evidence at all, or the deductions you draw. You're the criminologist, and I'll take your word for it. Just one thing remains to be explained. A minor point, perhaps, but worth mentioning. And what is that? Asked Sir Guy. Just how could a man of, let us say, 85 years commit these crimes? For if Jack the Ripper was around 30 in 1888 and lived, he'd be 85 today. Sir Guy Hollis was silent. At him there. But suppose he didn't get any older, whispered Sir Guy. What's that? Suppose Jack the Ripper didn't grow old. Suppose he is still a young man today. All right, I said. I'll suppose for a moment. Then I'll stop supposing and call for my nurse to restrain you. I'm serious, said Sir Guy. They all are, I told him. That's the pity of it all, isn't it? They know they hear voices and see demons, but we lock them up just the same. It was cruel, but it got results. He rose and faced me. It's a crazy theory, I grant you, he said. All the theories about the Ripper are crazy. The idea that he was a doctor, or a maniac, or a woman. The reasons advanced for such beliefs are flimsy enough. There is nothing to go by. So why should my notion be any worse? Because people grow older, I reasoned with him. Doctors, maniacs, and women alike. What about sorcerers? Sorcerers? necromancers, wizards, practices of black magic. What's the point? I studied, said Sir Guy. I studied everything. After a while, I began to study the dates of the murders. The pattern those dates formed, the rhythm, the solar, lunar, stellar rhythm, the sidereal aspect, the astrological significance. He was crazy, but I still listened. Suppose Jack the Ripper didn't murder for murder's sake alone. Suppose he wanted to make a sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Sir Guy shrugged. It is said that if you offer blood to the dark gods, that they grant boons. Yes, if a blood offering is made at the proper time, when the moon and the stars are right, and with the proper ceremonies, they grant boons. Boons of youth. Eternal youth. But that's nonsense. No, that's Jack the Ripper. I stood up. A most interesting theory, I told him. But, Sir Guy, there's just one thing I'm interested in. Why do you come here and tell it to me? I'm not an authority on witchcraft. I'm not a police official or criminologist. I'm a practicing psychiatrist. What's the connection? Sir Guy smiled. You are interested then? Well, yes. There must be some point. There is. But I wished to be assured of your interest first. Now, I can tell you my plan. And just what is this plan? Sir Guy gave me a long look. Then he spoke. John Carmody, he said, you and I are going to capture Jack the Ripper. That's the way it happened. I've given the gist of that first interview in all its intricate and somewhat boring detail because I think it's important. It helps to throw some light on Sir Guy's character and attitude. And in view of what happened after that, but I'm coming to those matters. Sir Guy's thought was simple. It wasn't even a thought, just a hunch. You know the people here, he told me. I've inquired. That's why I came to you as the ideal man for my purpose. You number amongst your acquaintances many writers, painters, poets, the so-called intelligentsia, the bohemians, the lunatic fringe from the near north side. For certain reasons, never mind what they are, my clues lead me to infer that Jack the Ripper is a member of that element. He chooses to pose as an eccentric. I have a feeling that with you to take me around and introduce me to your set, I might hit upon the right person. It's all right with me, I said. But just how are you going to look for him? As you say, he might be anybody, anywhere. And you have no idea what he looks like. He might be young or old. Jack the Ripper, a jack of all trades? Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer. How will you know? We shall see. Sir Guy sighed heavily. But I must find him at once. Why the hurry? Sir Guy sighed again. Because in 2 days, he will kill again. Are you sure? Sure as the stars. I plotted this chart, you see. All of the murders correspond to certain astrological rhythm patterns. If, as I suspect, he makes a blood sacrifice to renew his youth, he must murder within 2 days. Notice the pattern of his first crimes in London, August 7th, then August 31st, September 8th, September 30th, November 9th, intervals of 24 days, 9 days, 22 days. He killed 2 this time, and then 40 days. Of course, there were crimes in between. There had to be. But they weren't discovered and pinned on him. At any rate, I've worked out a pattern for him based on all my data. And I say that within the next 2 days, he kills. So I must seek him out somehow before then. And I'm still asking you, what you want me to do? Take me out, said Sir Guy. Introduce me to your friends. Take me to parties. But where do I begin? As far as I know, my artistic friends, despite their eccentricities, are all normal people. So is the Ripper. Perfectly normal. Except on certain nights. Again, that faraway look in Sir Guy's eyes. Then he becomes an ageless, pathological monster, crouching to kill on evenings when the stars blaze down in the blazing patterns of death. All right, I said. All right. I'll take you to parties, Sir Guy. I want to go myself anyway. I need the drinks. They'll serve there after listening to your kind of talk. We made our plans, and that evening, I took him over to Lester Baston's studio. As we ascended to the penthouse roof in the elevator, I took the opportunity to warn Sir Guy. Baston's a real screwball, I cautioned him. Sorry, his guest. Be prepared for anything and everything. I am. Sir Guy was perfectly serious. He put his hand in his trousers pocket and pulled out a gun. What the? I began. If I see him, I'll be ready, Sir Guy said. He didn't smile either. But you can't go running around at a party with a loaded revolver in your pocket, man. Don't worry. I won't behave foolishly. I wondered. Sir Guy Hollis was not, to my way of thinking, a normal man. We stepped out of the elevator, went toward Baston's apartment door. By the way, I murmured, just how do you wish to be introduced? Shall I tell him who you are and what you are looking for? I don't care. Perhaps it would be best to be frank. Don't you think that the Ripper, if by some miracle he or she is present, will immediately get the wind up and take cover? I think the shock of the announcement that I am hunting the Ripper will provoke some kind of betraying gesture on his part, said Sir Guy. You'd make a pretty good psychiatrist yourself, I conceded. It's a fine theory, but I warn you, you're going to be in for a lot of ribbing. This is a wild bunch. Sir Guy smiled. I'm ready, he announced. I have a little plan of my own. Don't be shocked at anything I do, he warned me. I nodded and knocked on the door. Baston opened it and poured out into the hall. His eyes were as red as the maraschino cherries in his Manhattan. He teetered back and forth, regarding us very gravely. He squinted at my square-cut Homburg hat and Sir Guy's mustache. "Aha!" he intoned. "The walrus and the carpenter." I introduced Sir Guy. "Welcome," said Baston. Gesturing us inside with over-elaborate courtesy, he stumbled after us into the garish parlor. I stared at the crowd that moved restlessly through the fog of cigarette smoke. It was the shank of the evening for this mob. Every hand held a drink. Every face held a slight, hectic flush. Over in one corner, the piano was going full blast, but the imperious strains of the march from The Love for the Three Oranges couldn't drown out the profanity from the crack game in the other corner. Prokofiev had no chance against African polo, and one set of ivories rattled louder than the other. Sir Guy got a monocle full right away. He saw Laverne Gonister, the poetess, hit Jaime Kralik in the eye. He saw Jaime sit down on the floor and cry until Dick Poole accidentally stepped on his stomach as he walked through to the dining room for a drink. He heard Nadia Villanov, the commercial artist, tell Johnny Oddcut that she thought his tattooing was in dreadful taste. And he saw Barclay Melton crawl under the dining room table with Johnny Oddcut's wife. His zoological observations might have continued indefinitely if Lester Baston hadn't stepped to the center of the room and called for silence by dropping a vase on the floor. "We have distinguished visitors in our midst," bawled Lester, waving his empty glass in our direction. "None other than the walrus and the carpenter. The walrus is Sir Guy Hollis, a something or other from the British Embassy. The carpenter, as you know, is our own John Carmody, the prominent dispenser of libido liniment." He turned and grabbed Sir Guy by the arm, dragging him to the middle of the carpet. For a moment I thought Hollis might object, but a quick wink reassured me he was prepared for this. "It is our custom, Sir Guy," said Baston loudly, "to subject our new friends to a little cross-examination. Just a little formality at these very informal gatherings, you understand. Are you prepared to answer questions?" Sir Guy nodded and grinned. "Very well," Baston muttered. "Friends, I give you this bundle from Britain, your witness." Then the ribbing started. I meant to listen, but at that moment, Lydia Dare saw me and dragged me off into the vestibule for one of those "darling, I waited for your call all day" routines. By the time I got rid of her and went back, the impromptu quiz session was in full swing. From the attitude of the crowd, I gathered that Sir Guy was doing all right for himself. Then Baston himself interjected a question that upset the apple cart. "And what, may I ask, brings you to our midst tonight? What is your mission, O walrus?" "I'm looking for Jack the Ripper." Nobody laughed. Perhaps it struck them all the way it did me. I glanced at my neighbors and began to wonder. Laverne Gonister, Jaime Kralik, Harmless, Dick Poole, Nadia Villanov, Johnny Oddcut and his wife, Barclay Melton, Lydia Dare, all harmless. But what a forced smile on Dick Poole's face! And that sly, self-conscious smirk that Barclay Melton wore. Oh, it was absurd, I grant you. But for the first time, I saw these people in a new light. I wondered about their lives, their secret lives, beyond the scenes of parties. How many of them were playing a part, concealing something? Who here would worship Hecate and grant that horrid goddess the dark boom of blood. Even Lester Baston might be masquerading. The mood was upon us all for a moment. I saw questions flicker in the circle of eyes around the room. Sir Guy stood there, and I could swear he was fully conscious of the situation he'd created and enjoyed it. I wondered idly just what was really wrong with him. Why he had this odd fixation concerning Jack the Ripper. Maybe he was hiding secrets, too. Baston, as usual, broke the mood. He burlesqued it. "The walrus isn't kidding, friends," he said. He slapped Sir Guy on the back and put his arm around him as he orated. "Our English cousin is really on the trail of the fabulous Jack the Ripper. You all remember Jack the Ripper, I presume? Quite a cut-up in the old days, as I recall. Really had some ripping good times when he went out on a tear. The walrus has some idea that the Ripper is still alive, probably prowling around Chicago with a Boy Scout knife. In fact," Baston paused impressively and shot it out in a rasping stage whisper. "In fact, he has reason to believe that Jack the Ripper might even be right here in our midst tonight." There was the expected reaction of giggles and grins. Baston eyed Lydia Dare reprovingly. "You girls needn't laugh," he smirked. "Jack the Ripper might be a woman, too. You know, sort of a Jill the Ripper." "You mean you actually suspect one of us?" shrieked Laverne Gonister, simpering up to Sir Guy. "But that Jack the Ripper person disappeared ages ago, didn't he? In 1888? "Aha!" interrupted Baston. "How do you know so much about it, young lady? Sounds suspicious. Watch her, Sir Guy. She may not be as young as she appears. These lady poets have dark past." The tension was gone. The mood was shattered, and the whole thing was beginning to degenerate into a trivial party joke. The man who had played the march was eyeing the piano with a scherzo gleam in his eye that augured ill for Prokofiev. Lydia Dare was glancing at the kitchen, waiting to make a break for another drink. Then Baston caught it. "Guess what?" he yelled. "The walrus has a gun." His embracing arm slipped and encountered the hard outline of the gun in Sir Guy's pocket. He snatched it out, and before Hollis had the opportunity to protest, I stared hard at Sir Guy, wondering if this thing had carried far enough. But he flicked a wink my way, and I remembered he had told me not to be alarmed. So I waited as Baston broached a drunken inspiration. "Let's play fair with our friend the walrus," he cried. "He came all the way from England to our party on this mission. If none of you is willing to confess, I suggest we give him a chance to find out the hard way." "What's up?" asked Johnny Oddcut. "I'll turn out the lights for 1 minute. Sir Guy can stand here with his gun. If anyone in this room is the Ripper, he can either run for it or take the opportunity to, well, eradicate his pursuer. Fair enough?" It was even sillier than it sounds, but it caught the popular fancy. Sir Guy's protest went unheard in the ensuing babble. Before I could stride over and put in my 2 cents worth, Lester Baston had reached the light switch. "Don't anybody move," he announced with fake solemnity. "For 1 minute, we will remain in darkness, perhaps at the mercy of a killer. At the end of that time, I'll turn up the lights again and look for bodies. Choose your partners, ladies and gentlemen." The lights went out. Somebody giggled. I heard footsteps in the darkness, mutterings. A hand brushed my face. The watch on my wrist ticked violently, but even louder. Rising above it, I heard another thumping. The beating of my heart. Absurd, standing in the dark with a group of tipsy fools. And yet there was real terror lurking here, rustling through the velvet blackness. Jack the Ripper prowled in darkness like this, and Jack the Ripper had a knife. Jack the Ripper had a madman's brain and a madman's purpose. But Jack the Ripper was dead. Dead in dust these many years, by every human law. Only there are no human laws when you feel yourself in the darkness, when the darkness hides and protects, and the outer mask slips off your face, and you feel something welling up within you, a brooding, shapeless purpose that is brother to the blackness. Sir Guy Hollis shrieked. There was a grisly thud. Baston had the lights on. Everybody screamed. Sir Guy Hollis lay sprawled on the floor in the center of the room. The gun was still clutched in his hand. I glanced at the faces, marveling at the variety of expressions human beings can assume when confronting horror. All the faces were present in the circle. Nobody had fled, and yet Sir Guy Hollis lay there. Laverne Gonister was wailing and hiding her face. All right. Sir Guy rolled over and jumped to his feet. He was smiling. Just an experiment, eh? Jack the Ripper were among those present and thought I had been murdered. He would have betrayed himself in some way when the lights went on and he saw me lying there. I am convinced of your individual and collective innocence. Just a gentle spoof, my friends. Hollis stared at the goggling Baston and the rest of them crowding in behind him. Shall we leave, John? He called to me. It's getting late, I think. Turning, he headed for the closet. I followed him. Nobody said a word. It was a pretty dull party after that. I met Sir Guy the following evening as we agreed, on the corner of 29th and South Halsted. After what had happened the night before, I was prepared for almost anything. But Sir Guy seemed matter of fact enough as he stood huddled against a grimy doorway and waited for me to appear. Boo! I said. Jumping out suddenly, he smiled. Only the betraying gesture of his left hand indicated that he instinctively reached for his gun when I startled him. All ready for our wild goose chase? I asked. Yes, he nodded. I'm glad that you agreed to meet me without asking questions, he told me. It shows you trust my judgment. He took my arm and edged me along the street slowly. It's foggy tonight, John, said Sir Guy Hollis. Like London. I nodded. Cold, too, for November. I nodded again and half shivered my agreement. Curious, mused Sir Guy. London fog and November. The place and the time of the Ripper murders. I grinned through darkness. Let me remind you, Sir Guy, that this isn't London, but Chicago, and it isn't November 1888. It's over 50 years later. Sir Guy returned my grin, but without mirth. I'm not so sure at that, he murmured. Look about you. These tangled alleys and twisted streets. They're like the East End. Mitra Square. And surely They are as ancient as 50 years, at least. You're in the colored neighborhood of South Clark Street, I said shortly. And why you dragged me down here, I still don't know. It's a hunch, Sir Guy admitted. Just a hunch. On my part, John. I want to wander around down here. There's the same geographical confirmation in these streets as in those courts where the Ripper roamed and slew. That's where we'll find him, John. Not in the bright lights of the bohemian neighborhood, but down here, in the darkness. The darkness where he waits and crouches. Is that why you brought a gun? I asked. I was unable to keep a trace of sarcastic nervousness from my voice. All of this talk, this incessant obsession with Jack the Ripper, got on my nerves more than I cared to admit. We may need a gun, said Sir Guy gravely. After all, tonight is the appointed night. I sighed. We wandered on through the foggy, deserted streets. Here and there, a dim light burned above a gin mill doorway. Otherwise, all was darkness and shadow. Deep, gaping alleyways loomed as we proceeded down a slanting side street. We crawled through that fog, alone and silent, like two tiny maggots floundering within a shroud. When that thought hit me, I winced. The atmosphere was beginning to get me, too. If I didn't watch my step, I'd go as loony as Sir Guy. Can't you see? There's not a soul around these streets, I said, tugging at his coat impatiently. He's bound to come, said Sir Guy. He'll be drawn here. This is what I've been looking for. A genius loci. An evil spot that attracts evil. Always when he slays, it's in the slums. You see, that must be one of his weaknesses. He has a fascination for squalor. Besides, the women he needs for sacrifice are more easily found in the dives and stew-pots of a great city. I smiled. Well, let's go into one of the dives or stew-pots, I suggested. I'm cold. Need a drink. This damn fog gets into your bones. You Britishers can stand it, but I like warmth and dry heat. We emerged from our side street and stood upon the threshold of an alley. Through the white clouds of mist ahead, I discerned a dim blue light, a naked bulb dangling from a beer sign above an alley tavern. Let's take a chance, I said. I'm beginning to shiver. Lead the way, said Sir Guy. I led him down the alley passage. We halted before the door of the dive. What are you waiting for? He asked. I'm just looking in, I told him. This is a tough neighborhood, Sir Guy. Never know what you're liable to run into. And I prefer we didn't get into the wrong company. Some of these Negro places resent white customers. Good idea, John. I finished my inspection through the doorway. Looks deserted, I murmured. Let's try it. We entered a dingy bar. A feeble light flickered above the counter and railing, but failed to penetrate the further gloom of the back booths. A gigantic Negro lolled across the bar, a black giant with prognathous jaw and ape-like torso. He scarcely stirred as we came in, but his eyes flicked open quite suddenly, and I knew he noted our presence and was judging us. Evening, I said. He took his time before replying, still sizing us up. Then he grinned. Evening, gents. What's your pleasure? Gin, I said. 2 gins. It's a cold night. That's right, gents. He poured, I paid, and took the glasses over to one of the booths. We wasted no time in emptying them. The fiery liquor warmed. I went over to the bar and got the bottle. Sir Guy and I poured ourselves another drink. The big Negro went back into his doze, with one wary eye half open against any sudden activity. The clock over the bar ticked on. The wind was rising outside, tearing the shroud of fog to ragged shreds. Sir Guy and I sat in the warm booth and drank our gin. We began to talk, and the shadows crept up about us to listen. He rambled a great deal. He went over everything he'd said in the office when I met him, just as though I hadn't heard it before. The poor devils with obsessions are like that. I listened very patiently. I poured Sir Guy another drink, and another. But the liquor only made him more talkative. How he did run on about ritual killings and prolonging the life unnaturally. The whole fantastic tale came out again. And of course, he maintained his unyielding conviction that the Ripper was abroad tonight. I suppose I was guilty of goading him. Very well, I said, unable to keep the impatience from my voice. Let us say that your theory is correct, even though we must overlook every natural law and swallow a lot of superstition to give it any credence. But let us say, for the sake of argument, that you are right. Jack the Ripper was a man who discovered how to prolong his own life through making human sacrifices. He did travel around the world, as you believe. He is in Chicago now, and he is planning to kill. In other words, let us suppose that everything you claim is gospel truth. So what? What do you mean, so what? Said Sir Guy. I mean, so what? I answered. If all this is true, it still doesn't prove that by sitting down in a dingy gin mill on the south side, Jack the Ripper is going to walk in here and let you kill him or turn him over to the police. And come to think of it, I don't even know now just what you intend to do with him if you ever did find him. Sir Guy gulped his gin. I'd capture the bloody swine, he said. Capture him and turn him over to the government, together with all the papers and documentary evidence I've collected against him over a period of many years. I've spent a fortune investigating this affair. I tell you, a fortune! His capture will mean the solution of hundreds of unsolved crimes. Of that I am convinced. I tell you, a mad beast is loose on this world. An ageless, eternal beast sacrificing to Hecate and the dark gods. In vino varietas, or was all this babbling the result of too much gin? It didn't matter. Sir Guy Hollis had another. I sat there and wondered what to do with him. The man was rapidly working up to a climax of hysterical drunkenness. One other point, I said, more for the sake of conversation than in any hopes of obtaining information. You still don't explain how it is that you hope to just blunder into the Ripper. He'll be around, said Sir Guy. I'm psychic. I know. Sir Guy wasn't psychic. He was maudlin. The whole business was beginning to infuriate me. We'd been sitting here an hour, and during all this time, I'd been forced to play nursemaid and audience to a babbling idiot. After all, he wasn't a regular patient of mine. That's enough, I said, putting out my hand as Sir Guy reached for the half-emptied bottle again. You've had plenty. Now I've got a suggestion to make. Let's call a cab and get out of here. It's getting late, and it doesn't look as though your elusive friend is going to put in his appearance. Tomorrow, if I were you, I'd plan to turn all those papers and documents over to the FBI. If you're so convinced of the truth of your wild theory, they are competent to make a very thorough investigation and find your man. No. Sir Guy was drunkenly obstinate. No cab. Let's get out of here anyway, I said, glancing at my watch. It's past midnight. He sighed, shrugged, and rose unsteadily. As he started for the door, he tugged the gun free from his pocket. Here, give me that, I whispered. You can't walk around the street brandishing that thing. I took the gun and slipped it inside my coat. And I got hold of his right arm and steered him out of the door. The Negro didn't look up as we departed. We stood shivering in the alleyway. The fog had increased. I couldn't see either end of the alley from where we stood. It was cold, damp, dark. Fog or no fog, a little wind was whispering secrets to the shadows at our backs. The fresh air hit Sir Guy just as I expected it would. Fog and gin fumes don't mingle very well. He lurched as I guided him slowly through the mist. Sir Guy, despite his incapacity, still stared apprehensively at the alley, as though he expected to see a figure approaching. Disgust got the better of me. Childish foolishness, I snorted. Jack the Ripper indeed. I call this carrying a hobby too far. Hobby? He faced me. Through the fog, I could see his distorted face. You call this a hobby? Well, what is it? I grumbled. Just why else are you so interested in tracking down this mythical killer? My arm held his, but his stare held me. In London, he whispered, in 1888, one of those nameless drabs the Ripper slew was my mother. What? Later, I was recognized by my father and legitimized. We swore to give our lives to find the Ripper. My father was the first to search. He died in Hollywood in 1926 on the trail of the Ripper. They said he was stabbed by an unknown assailant in a brawl. But I know who that assailant was. So I've taken up his work. Do you see, John? I've carried on, and I will carry on until I do find him and kill him with my own hands. He took my mother's life and the lives of hundreds to keep his own hellish being alive. Like a vampire, he battens on blood. Like a ghoul, he is nourished by death. Like a fiend, he stalks the world to kill. He is cunning, devilishly cunning, but I'll never rest until I find him, never. I believed him then. He wouldn't give up. He wasn't just a drunken blabber anymore. He was as fanatical, as determined, as relentless as the Ripper himself. Tomorrow, he'd be sober. He'd continue the search. Perhaps he'd turn those papers over to the FBI, sooner or later, with such persistence and with his motive. He'd be successful. I'd always known he had a motive. Let's go. I said, steering him down the alley. Wait a minute, said Sir Guy. Give me back my gun. He lurched a little. I'd feel better with the gun on me. He pressed me into the dark shadows of a little recess. I tried to shug him off, but he was insistent. Let me carry the gun now, John, he mumbled. All right, I said. I reached into my coat, brought my hand out. But that's not a gun, he protested. That's a knife. I know. I bore down on him swiftly. John! He screamed. Never mind the John, I whispered, raising the knife. Just call me Jack. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.